I'm Julia Carter, 38 years old, and I once held a critical strategic role at a major tech firm in Boston. 13 years of relentless dedication. I even missed my father's funeral for a meeting. But on the morning Ethan Hensley, the founder's son, walked into the company as the new CEO, he looked at me like I was a dusty old file and said, "You're no longer necessary." No thank you. No handshake. I was fired in the break room in front of everyone who once called me their leader. Have you ever been erased from your own life with a single cold sentence? Share it in the comments. If you've ever been underestimated or stood at the edge of an unfair turning point, hit like, subscribe, and let me tell you what happened next. Because Ethan had no idea. I was ready for something he could never have imagined. I drove home in silence. Outside the window, Boston faded under a sheer layer of rain, like a veil blurring every sound, every thought. But inside my head, the past came back in waves, vivid as if it were only yesterday. 13 years ago, I walked into Hensley Tech with nothing more than a handbag and a hastily printed strategy deck. The company was drowning in debt, scrambling through a wave of tech disruption, unsure which way to survive. I didn't just bring them a plan. I brought them belief. I spent countless sleepless nights studying Asian markets, forging relationships in Singapore, Tokyo, and Seoul. And I convinced those corporate giants, Hensley Tech was worth trusting. The first success came after nearly 2 years of grinding. A deal worth $12 million was signed. Ethan back then was just a fresh MBA graduate, regularly stopping by his father's office to learn the ropes. I still remember the day he asked me, "Why do you still fly economy? Doesn't the company cover business class?" I laughed and said, "Saving every dollar is how you keep investors loyal." He laughed too, the kind of laugh only someone who's never carried real weight on their shoulders could give. But I didn't care. I kept working. Kept cutting pieces of my personal life just to keep the company afloat. I canceled the only vacation I had planned that year to handle a production crisis in Canada. I once stood before my own wedding and told my fiancé, "I need 6 more months. Just 6. And he walked away, not because he didn't love me but because he was exhausted from always waiting in the background. One night, I got a call that my mother had been hospitalized from a mild stroke. I was in South Korea at the time, deep in negotiations with the country's largest telecom provider. I didn't fly home immediately. I called her. Her voice was weak but she managed to smile through the phone. "I'm okay, honey. Stay there, this matters more." It was her 70th birthday. I wasn't there. I once wanted to adopt a baby girl. The paperwork was done. I had already chosen a name, Ellie. But just 2 days before the final decision, I got an emergency call from the board. One of our Arizona branches was under investigation for financial misconduct. I took the red eye that night. By the time I got back, the adoption center had sent a rejection letter. "We need a present parent, not one who only sends gifts on holidays." I read that sentence dozens of times. I didn't get angry. It just felt hollow. I used to think Ethan could be part of the company's future. When his father began transitioning into retirement, I proposed a soft handover plan, giving Ethan time to observe, to grow, and to earn respect from within. But Ethan didn't want time. He wanted everything: power, recognition, the biggest chair without having to climb a single rung. At a board meeting last month, I fiercely opposed a plan to acquire a data company under federal investigation for violating user privacy. I said, "The PR risk is too high. If we want sustainable growth, we need to preserve trust, not just the balance sheet." Ethan sneered, "You're still stuck in the old era? This is a time for growth by speed, not by ethics." I turned to him, calm but firm. "I'm trying to keep you from walking straight into a federal probe." He leaned across the table, tilting his head like I was some outdated relic. "You really think you still have the edge to understand today's market? You're not this company's future anymore. You're just leftover." That sentence cut deep. Not because I feared being old or outdated, but because I realized the sacrifices I once believed had meaning existed only in silence. When Ethan fired me that morning, no one said a word. People I had mentored stared at their keyboards, pretending not to see. But I didn't blame them. In places like Hensley Tech, survival is often built on silence. I stood in my living room staring out the window. Boston was still draped in rain. I pressed my palm to the cold glass, wondering, what had I really traded away? To hold on to a seat that someone else could yank from under me with a shrug? I didn't have an answer. But I knew this. Ethan thought he had discarded me like old furniture. What he didn't know was, I had been ready to leave that table for a long time. And what waited ahead wasn't an ending. It was the beginning. I sat quietly in my little kitchen, a cup of coffee long gone cold on the table. The warm light above made everything seem calmer than it truly was. It was still raining outside, but inside me the storm had already shifted. I reached into my bag and pulled out a different phone. Not the one I used for Hensley, but the one I kept for contacts no one at the company ever knew about. I dialed. Julia. A low, clear, familiar voice answered after a few rings. I was fired this morning, I said evenly as if I were delivering a quarterly report. The man on the other end paused. He actually did it? In the break room. No warning. No conversation. A faint sigh. Then phase 1 has begun. I nodded even though he couldn't see me. I'm ready. The man I was speaking with was Simon Caldwell, founder of Redpoint 9, a venture capital firm. He had been my strategic partner in 3 major deals back when I was still at Hensley. A year ago, when I saw Hensley veering into territory I could no longer influence, I met Simon at a small bar in South Boston. I want to invest in the future, I told him that night. Not the kind that's built on names but on results. The kind where talent speaks for itself. Simon narrowed his eyes. You're talking about yourself? I'm talking about everyone who's ever been pushed away from the table just because their last name wasn't Hensley. Soon after that, I began moving capital into Brandwick Systems, a mid-sized tech company preparing to restructure and compete in AI and data analytics. Thanks to past relationships and Simon's trust, I was invited to the board as the second largest shareholder. But more importantly, I wasn't there just to invest. I came to build something from the ground up again on fairer ground. Right after the call, I changed clothes and drove to the new office. Brandwick's headquarters sat modestly in Cambridge, just 12 blocks from Hensley. As I walked through the glass doors, the receptionist looked up and smiled brightly. Good afternoon, Carter. The conference room is ready. I nodded. Thanks, Ellie. Her name mirrored the one I had once chosen for the daughter I never got to meet. It made me pause for a moment. Then it reminded me to keep walking with a steadier heart. In the conference room, Brandwick's leadership was waiting. Simon sat at the head of the table, flanked by Alex, the CFO, and Renee, the head of product. Good you're here, Simon said. Hensley's just had a shake-up. I'm the shake-up, I replied, setting down my bag and opening my laptop. I quickly outlined the plan I had been preparing for months. A proposal to acquire Hensley's struggling data analytics division, the one working on an AI platform for supply chain systems. What Ethan didn't know was that the division was deeply in the red, bleeding from bad strategy and unchecked costs. Ethan's going to try and sell it off quickly to patch the budget, I said, pointing at the chart on screen. We'll be there at just the right time. At the lowest price possible, Alex nodded, his eyes lighting up. I've worked with most of the engineers in that group, I continued. They're not loyal to Hensley. They're loyal to someone who understands them. And I used to be that person. Renee tilted her head slightly. Are you ready to lead if we pull this off? I'm not just ready. I've already started. The room went quiet for a few seconds. Then Simon spoke. The board met earlier. We've unanimously agreed to appoint you as interim CEO, effective immediately. I nodded, not surprised. The decision had been discussed beforehand, but now, it carried a completely different weight. I wasn't standing behind the curtain anymore. I was holding the spotlight, pointing it at the part Ethan thought didn't matter. After the meeting, I walked down the long hallway to my new office. This place wasn't as flashy as Hensley, but it had something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. I sat down on a slightly stiff leather chair, opened my email, and typed the first line of a message to all Brandwick employees. We're not building an empire. We're building a workplace community built not on last names, but on intellect and kindness. Right below that, I attached the schedule for our first meeting with the engineering team I was planning to recruit, from the very company that had shut its doors on me earlier that morning. Ethan had no idea that every arrogant step he took was paving the road for me to walk straight into the territory he believed he'd rule alone. And now the game was only just beginning. I spent the entire next morning with Brandwick's legal team on the third floor, where sunlight poured through the wide glass panels overlooking Cambridge. On the table sat a stack of documents I had requested in advance. Every supply contract and partnership agreement between Hensley Tech and its strategic clients, especially their largest enterprise customers. Alex, head of legal, handed me a heavily marked-up printout. "There's something here you'll want to see right away," he said, his voice tighter than usual. I turned the page, eyes settling on the section highlighted in red. It was an addendum to the renewal contract between Hensley and Kinross Analytics, one of the biggest clients I'd negotiated for last year. Valued at $18 million over 3 years, it was a major pillar in Hensley's quarterly recurring revenue. 3 months ago, Kinross sent a letter requesting to renegotiate payment terms, Alex explained. "You were the designated point of contact under the prior agreement." He pointed to a note. But when they sent it to Hensley's office, Ethan responded himself. He told their lawyers the person in charge was no longer with the company and that Hensley wouldn't continue the support provisions in the renewal. I looked up, chilled. He unilaterally cancelled the technical support clause? Exactly. And more importantly, under that contract, failure to provide support during the renewal window counts as a material breach, giving Kinross the right to exit with zero penalty. I leaned back in my chair, mind spinning between disbelief and clarity. Ethan thought he was proving he had control, but what he really did was tear open a fault line in the company's financial foundation. "Do we have direct contact at Kinross?" I asked. Alex flipped through his notes. "Their representative is Lawrence Cho. I remember you two were fairly close." I nodded. I was the only one willing to stay up all night on that data dispute call. We used to call each other crisis allies. I smiled, though it quickly faded into a deeper instinct to act. I reached for my phone and searched for Lawrence's number. My fingers had just tapped the screen when Alex stopped me. "Julia," he said quietly. "You're calling him now?" I looked him in the eye. "I'm not calling to apologize for Ethan. I'm calling to offer him a new option." I dialed. The phone rang just twice. "Julia Carter," Lawrence answered, his voice as deep and steady as I remembered. "Hi, Lawrence," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the adrenaline. "I heard about the issue with Hensley. I think you might want to hear a different proposal." "You're calling from Hensley?" "I'm no longer with them," I answered directly. "I'm currently serving as interim lead at Branwick. And I believe we can offer you a more complete solution, both technically and strategically." The other end of the line went silent for a moment. I didn't interrupt. Finally, he said, "Sounds like you've been planning this for a while." "I didn't have much choice once short-sighted people started running things," I replied honestly. He exhaled. "I'll be in Boston this Friday. If you can make the time, I'll visit Branwick's office." "I'll meet you personally," I said. That Friday morning, I waited in Branwick's front lobby, where large screen displays were looping our latest product demos. When Lawrence arrived with 2 associates, he shook my hand firmly. "Still remember that coffee from our all-nighter?" he asked, referring to the marathon meeting we once had at Hensley. "I remember. I even bought the same roast, waiting in the conference room," I smiled, walking him down the main hall. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. My engineering team walked them through our new integration roadmap, plans for a dedicated 24/7 response team, and a clearer, transparent pricing structure. Lawrence asked a lot. He drilled into every metric, every small detail. But when he finally stood to leave, he said just one thing. "I like how you kept saying we instead of I." I walked them to the door, fully aware of what had just happened. Lawrence hadn't made any promises. No contracts were signed. But the way he looked back at me as he left, that was the look of someone returning to the one person who had once kept their word when everything else fell apart. Ethan likely had no clue. But now one of his most stable revenue anchors was beginning to tilt toward me. And I wouldn't need to push. I just had to stand in the right place. The rest, Hensley would dismantle itself. That morning, the National Tech Conference in New York lit up like a quiet battlefield under the spotlight. On the main stage, Hensley Tech's logo shimmered against a massive LED backdrop. I sat in the 3rd row, quietly watching in a charcoal suit, eyes fixed on the man walking up to the podium with a confident smile and a polished, empty stance. Ethan Hensley. Same slicked back hair, same voice sharpened by a dozen rehearsed speeches, still unable to hide the lack of depth in his words, especially when discussing tech he clearly didn't understand. He introduced Novalink, an AI-powered supply chain platform, a breakthrough solution Hensley Tech has spent the past 2 years developing. I leaned toward Simon seated next to me and whispered, 2 years? When I pitched that he was backpacking through Europe. Simon smirked. You ready? I nodded, my fingers tightening around the folder I had prepared days ago. Across the aisle I caught Lawrence Cho's eye. He gave a small, nearly invisible nod. To anyone else it meant nothing. To me it was everything. On stage Ethan closed his presentation with a line pulled straight from the strategy draft I once wrote. We don't just connect data. We reshape trust. I almost laughed. Even the tagline was something I'd revised 3 times before he dismissed it. The moderator stepped out. Thank you to the representative from Hensley Tech. Up next, please welcome Julia Carter, interim CEO of Brandwick Systems, to share a new approach to AI integration in supply chain networks. I walked up to the stage. The entire room turned. A few familiar faces from Hensley widened their eyes. I saw my former assistant Jenna, seated with Ethan's engineering team. She held her breath. I opened my laptop. The Brandwick logo appeared clearly, followed by the project name, Veritas Platform, Transparent Data, Enduring Trust. I spoke slowly, each word steady without needing dramatics. A year ago, I proposed an AI platform to Hensley Tech's leadership, focused on transparency, real-time response, and learning from supply behavior. It was rejected for being too niche and hard to market. Today, I'm introducing that same platform, with a new name developed here at Brandwick Systems. I clicked to the next slide. On the screen appeared an intuitive interface, showing real-time supply chain analytics, early risk alerts, and adaptive algorithm recommendations. The skeptical glances across the room began to shift. Veritas isn't just a concept. It's a finished product, tested successfully with 3 major companies, including Kinross Analytics. A murmur rose from the right side of the hall. I saw Ethan lean toward a colleague, whispering something. I advanced to the final slide. Veritas is now patented under number US 2179802B1. Any infringement of this platform's concept or interface will be subject to legal action. Simon cleared his throat, his hand resting on the mic in front of him. Brandwick Systems is open to global strategic integration partnerships for Veritas. We don't hoard exclusivity, but we do uphold standards. The air in the hall tightened, then erupted. A representative from Allied Freight, Hensley's largest logistics partner, stood up and left his seat. A minute later, I saw him walk toward Brandwick's delegation and hand Simon his business card. Ethan shot up. His face flushed red as he stormed out of the hall. No one stopped him. No one said a word. It was the most brutal kind of silence, the silence of truth. As I stepped off stage, Jenna caught up to me in the hallway. You reminded me why I ever wanted to work in this field, she whispered. I placed my hand on her shoulder, saying nothing. Because I knew that feeling. And I knew some things couldn't be reclaimed, but they could be started again with real value and earned respect. In the small room behind the stage, Simon handed me a printed sheet. 3 partners have already requested private meetings this afternoon. Ethan's lost at least 2 deals in under an hour. I nodded. This wasn't a noisy battle. But every move left echoes. And today I didn't have to raise my voice to be heard. My work had spoken for itself. 3 days after the conference in New York, my phone rang just as I was stepping into the elevator at Brandwick headquarters. It was Jenna. Did you see the paper this morning? She asked, her voice uneasy. I haven't yet. What's going on? Front page of the Business Beacon. Ethan's officially reignited that internal investigation from 3 years ago. Full headline: Julia Carter once accused of data manipulation during explosive growth period. I froze, my arms stiffening as the elevator doors closed. A part of me had expected this. Ethan was the type to go low when he couldn't win clean. The investigation they mentioned took place the year I secured a contract with a major defense corporation. Our numbers were so strong, the board demanded an internal audit. I complied fully, handed over everything including personal work journals. The final report found no wrongdoing. But what Ethan didn't know was that I had saved all the original files and audio recordings of the last closed-door session, where he tried to cover up an unauthorized marketing overspend he had signed off on. That meeting never went public because his father, Mr. Hensley, stepped in to settle things quietly. I sat at my desk, unlocked the small safe underneath, and pulled out the silver USB I'd kept for years. Inside were all the records, internal memos, email threads, and a high-quality audio file where Ethan clearly said, "If we disclose the budget breach, I'll be the first one out. Just keep it quiet." I knew releasing it now wasn't just about clearing my name. It was evidence that Ethan was weaponizing the media to distort the truth. And I needed someone to bring it to light, someone untouched by corporate sponsorship or boardroom politics. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a familiar name, Marcus Lee, an investigative journalist who'd been fired from a major outlet after exposing fraud tied to its largest pharmaceutical sponsor. That year he was blacklisted. And I, still on Hensley's board at the time, helped secure an independent media contract so he could keep digging without corporate interference. We hadn't spoken since. I texted him simply, "I have a story. This time it's mine." Not even 3 minutes later he called. "Julia? What's happening? You remember the Hensley case from 3 years ago? It's back on the front page." "That piece was bought and planted." "I could tell by the wording," Marcus replied sharply. "I have the recordings. And all supporting documents. If you're ready, I want to hand it all over." I sent him the entire file set with one note: no edits. No filters. Let the truth speak. 3 days later, the story broke on the Atlantic Report, an independent outlet where Marcus now worked. The homepage headline was bold, stark against a white background: "The woman they fired might be the one saving tech." The piece ran over 5,000 words. It quoted entire clips from the internal meetings between Ethan and the audit team. It included verified documents from Hensley's legal division. Marcus even interviewed former staff I had led, people who described how I shielded engineers from unnecessary layoffs, personally flew cross-country to fix client crises, and responded to emergency tickets for a pregnant hospital technician terrified that our system bug might delay critical care. The article didn't need flair. It stacked facts like bricks, letting the readers build their own wall of trust. That afternoon, as I walked out of the office, people looked at me differently. No longer the cautious stares from my early days at Branwick, but the kind of respect earned when the truth stands taller than rumors. Jenna called, her voice thick with emotion. "I always believed you. But today, I think everyone else finally does too." I didn't answer right away. I looked out the tall office window as golden sunlight blanketed the rooftops of New York. The traffic below moved steadily. But somewhere down there I knew Ethan had read the article. And now he had nowhere left to spin. No media to buy. No narrative to twist. Just the truth, undeniable and permanent. That night, just before 1 a.m., my phone rang. I almost didn't answer. Calls at that hour rarely bring good news. But when I saw the screen say Susan Hensley, I froze. The last time I spoke to her was 4 years ago at a company holiday event. She'd always been warm, gracious, and quietly removed from corporate matters. I answered the call. "Julia." Her voice trembled from the very first word. "I'm here, Susan. Are you all right?" Pause. Then a soft, stifled sob. "No, I'm not." I sat up straight in bed, pulling the blanket to my waist, my back against the cold wall. "What happened?" "You'll have to forgive me for calling this late," she said. "But I don't know who else to turn to." Her voice trembled, then she added, "I read the article today. I know everything now." I closed my eyes gently. I never meant for it to go this far. But Ethan chose to make it public. "I understand. I really do." I heard the sound of water being poured on the other end. Maybe it was Mr. Hensley. Or maybe she was sitting alone in the kitchen, just as I often did when storms raged quietly inside. "Julia," she hesitated. "Back then, I always hoped you'd become my daughter-in-law. He used to admire you deeply. But everything changed so quickly. Since his father stepped back, he hasn't listened to anyone." I didn't respond. Some things are too old to call back, yet still sharp enough to sting when remembered. "I know you opposed some of Ethan's projects," she continued, her voice growing softer. "But I never imagined he'd treat you this way." She took a breath, then whispered, "If you were my own daughter, I couldn't be prouder than having someone like you walk beside this company." A lump caught in my throat. For years, I had kept my distance from the Hensley family, never thinking that behind those cold boardrooms and formal decisions was a woman who had quietly held a place for me in her heart. I tried to keep my voice steady. "I've left Hensley. It's done." "No, Julia. You don't understand." Her voice grew strangely firm. "They say Ethan holds executive power. But the one who still holds voting control is his father." I froze. "Mr. Hensley still controls the majority stake." He never believed Ethan was ready. At first he just wanted to let him try to learn through mistakes. But when he found out you were terminated without any internal notice, he was truly furious. I felt a chill run down my back. If what she said was true, then Mr. Hensley could step in at any moment. And Ethan was running an empire he didn't actually own. "He's flying back from Switzerland," she went on. "He said he has to see you. In person. Before making any final decision about the CEO position." I gripped the edge of my blanket. Are you sure?" "I'm sure," she answered quickly. "I've lived with him for nearly 40 years. I've never seen him this angry." He canceled an entire conference tour over a domestic issue. But he said, "If someone like Julia gets pushed out, then Hensley isn't Hensley anymore." I didn't know what to say. The night was too deep and my senses felt stretched thin between dream and reality. "I didn't call to beg you to come back," she said, her voice softening again. "I called to tell you, I believe in you. And if there ever comes a day when you need someone in your corner, don't forget, not everyone in this family has turned their back." I looked out the window. The streets below were frozen in silence. Inside me was a blend of gratitude, suspicion, and something fragile I dared not name: hope. "Thank you for calling," I said slowly. I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that. "Get some rest, Julia," she whispered. "Tomorrow will be long." I ended the call and sat there for a while longer. Outside, the rain had stopped. But inside me something had begun to shift. This wasn't just a battle between me and Ethan anymore. It was between the hollow performance of leadership and the real values we once claimed to build. The boardroom on the 18th floor of Hensley Tech's headquarters felt different that morning. Same long walnut table. Same sheer curtains falling beside the tall glass windows. Same morning sunlight slicing down over Boston's financial district. But the air inside was not the same. Familiar faces from the board, many of whom I'd worked alongside for over a decade, now sat stiffly, barely breathing. In front of each was a leather-bound document marked "Confidential Q4 Meeting." I entered alongside Mr. Hensley, a man who hadn't attended one of these meetings in 3 years, mentioned more like a myth than a presence. He walked slowly, cane in hand, but his eyes were sharp, his presence commanding, just as it had been when he ran this company directly. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. One glance from him was enough to quiet the room. Ethan was already there, seated at the opposite end. He didn't look at me when I walked in. He tapped his fingers on the table, his polished suit hiding the nervous tension in his posture. An assistant stepped out to officially begin the meeting. After the standard financial reports, Mr. Hensley stood with the help of his cane. Every eye turned toward him. Even Ethan froze. "I'd like to speak as founding shareholder," he began, his voice deeper and clearer than I expected. "And as the person still holding over 38% of the company's voting rights." A murmur swept the room. That was no small number. And clearly many hadn't realized he still held that much. "I've been watching this company's restructuring, its development and strategic relationships throughout the past quarter," he continued. "And I am not pleased. Not just with the numbers, but with how the core values of this company are being eroded, day by day, through reckless and irresponsible decisions." Ethan jumped in, trying to stay calm. "Dad, if there are any numbers or strategies you don't understand, we can talk privately." "But..." "No, Mr. Hensley interrupted, eyes still locked on his son. "This needs to be clear. To everyone." I stayed silent, hands resting lightly on the file in front of me. I knew what was coming. We had talked late into the night, nearly 3 hours, in his old office, the place where so many of the company's defining plans had been born. I hereby transfer my voting rights temporarily to Julia Carter, he said. Because I believe she will protect the people who actually built this company instead of chasing the spotlight built off their work. The room fell completely silent. Ethan stood up abruptly. You can't do that, he snapped. She doesn't even work here anymore. Hensley didn't respond. He simply looked at the legal aide who immediately opened the documents for the board. The signed authorization stamped and certified by the company's attorneys. Every procedure had been followed. I opened my own folder and pulled out a supplemental financial report. I'd like to present a file regarding the Q2 acquisition of TCG Analytics, I said, my voice firm and measured. Why bring that up now? Ethan interrupted. His expression changed instantly. Because I believe many of you don't know the deal was signed 3 weeks before it was officially presented, and a brokerage fee of over $800,000 was routed through an unverified intermediary, I continued. That document is, Ethan tried to cut in. Verified by an independent audit firm, I said, not giving him space. And it includes a copy of an email from Ethan's personal account to that intermediary. The contents show an agreement to keep quiet and a promise of a bonus if the deal went through quickly. An older board member at the far end of the table spoke. Ethan, do you have a response? Ethan said nothing. Then he looked at me, eyes once so sure now drifting. This is a witch hunt. She's just trying to get revenge. This is a test of integrity, I replied. And integrity doesn't seek revenge. It just needs to be brought into the light. Hensley nodded. I call for a vote of no confidence in Ethan Hensley as acting CEO, and request immediate suspension from all executive roles pending the outcome of an internal audit. Each board member voted in turn. There were no surprises. Even those who had once sided with Ethan could no longer pretend not to see. When the results were announced, Ethan sank into his chair, his face pale. No one said a word to him. No one stood by him. The same people who once laughed with him in meeting rooms now lowered their heads and flipped through other documents as if they had never known him. I looked around the room where I had built my entire career, where I had once gritted my teeth just to hold on to the smallest influence. Today I was no longer the former employee they pushed out. I was sitting at the center. My voice no longer had to shout to be heard. It stood firm on the truth and the trust one had earned back. I left the boardroom to the soft click of the door closing behind me. Glances, nods, and congratulatory pats on the back followed me faintly down the hallway, but I barely heard them. Everything faded into the quiet space between my heartbeat and the sound of my heels on the marble floor. The elevator took me to the ground floor, where afternoon light streamed through towering glass like a pale gold ribbon. I stood still before the large windows, watching the people pass by, wondering, what had I really gained from all this besides a title and a vague feeling that I had won? I had stood my ground, proven my ability, defended justice in the way I had long hoped to. But among all those victories I realized something bitter. I no longer knew who I was when I wasn't fighting. I drove home and sat alone at my familiar kitchen table, opening an old wooden box I kept on the highest shelf. Inside were unsent letters, faded photographs, and a copy of the adoption application that had been denied years ago. On top lay a small birthday card, no year written, just one line in thick, messy ink. I hope someday I can tell you about her. I held the card, then set it down. I opened my phone and searched for a name I had avoided for years. Daniel Cole. Daniel was a pediatrician in Seattle, once my boyfriend nearly a decade ago. He was gentle, patient, and always saw the best in people. He was the one who suggested we adopt Ellie together when he learned I couldn't have children. But work swept me away. Delays, endless meetings, promises like, after this project is done. Until one day Daniel said, I want a family. Not just on paper. But at dinner, in stories, in summer laughter. And I had no answer. This time I simply wrote, I'll be in Seattle this weekend. If you're free, can we meet? Less than 5 minutes later he replied. Of course. Always. We met at a cafe overlooking Lake Union. Daniel hadn't changed much. Same light brown, slightly tousled hair, the same warm eyes, the same calm pace of someone who listens more than he speaks. Still remember this place? He asked, sipping espresso. I do, I smiled softly. I remember the window seat was where you once said if we had a child, you'd name them depending on whether it was rainy or sunny that day. And you laughed and said they'd hate us if we named them Storm, he chuckled. His gaze held no blame, only a peace that nearly brought me to tears. We talked for a long time. About the years that had passed. About his hospital. About a little girl named Mia he was caring for. A child abandoned at birth, bright and obsessed with puzzles. And then gently he asked, "What about you? Anything new?" I looked down at the cup of tea gone cold. After a pause, I answered without meeting his eyes. I just had someone removed from a company he thought he owned. I saved a major deal. I proved I'm not someone who deserved to be pushed out. Daniel didn't respond right away. He waited quiet. But I don't feel joy, I continued. I just feel empty. So empty I don't know what makes me happy anymore. I finally looked at him, saying something I had never even admitted to myself. I don't want to win anymore. I want to live. Daniel looked at me for a long time. Then he placed his hand on the table, not touching me, just near enough that I could feel the warmth. "Then start living," he said. "From wherever you want. By the lake with a child, or simply over a cup of tea you don't have to rush to finish." I nodded, still unable to blink. I sat in Mr. Hensley's office on a cold winter morning, gray light falling across the papers on his desk. Outside, Boston was cloaked in soft layers of fog, like an unfinished painting. He handed me a thick envelope stamped "Confidential." "The board has agreed," he said slowly. "They want you to take the role of permanent CEO. Not just because of what you've done, but because there's no one else who can lead right now." I looked at him, heart full. Then quietly pushed the file back. "I can't accept." "Why not?" he asked, surprised but not angry. "Because I used to think the top was that chair," I said, my voice light as breath. But standing in it, all I saw was a larger emptiness than any boardroom I've ever entered. "I don't want to repeat the old structure. I want to change it." He sat in silence for a moment. Then he smiled, not as an executive but as a father, a man who'd lived long enough to understand the power of saying no. "You really have changed," he said. "And that's exactly why you're ready to lead." Weeks later, I launched Foundation 28, a program designed to train and support women who had been excluded from leadership roles in tech. The name 28 came from the average percentage of women who had once held executive titles, before being replaced for reasons unrelated to performance, according to a report I had worked on years ago. I didn't want this foundation to be just about skill building. I wanted it to be a place where women like me, those labeled as past their prime, out of step with the times, or too assertive to be soft, could finally tell their story in their own voice. Branwick went public at the start of the new quarter. Its opening share price exceeded projections by nearly 30%. Simon sent me a card. "We didn't just build a company. We proved justice can be profitable." Hensley Tech, after the financial crisis and leadership shakeup, also began its recovery. A new executive team was appointed, many of whom were people I had once recruited and mentored in the early days. When I visited the old office, a young female director ran up and hugged me tightly, her eyes misting over. "If you hadn't believed in me back then," she whispered, "I would have left this career behind." I didn't say anything. I just squeezed her hand and smiled. Some words don't need to be spoken aloud. Sometimes just being there is enough. That afternoon, I stepped onto the rooftop of the building that once felt like the center of my world. Boston stretched out below me, skyscraper windows catching the sunset like shards of glass. A soft breeze blew, carrying the scent of salt from the distant riverbanks. I leaned against the railing, the cold air piercing through my coat. Below, the traffic flowed steadily. The city never stopped, never waited. But in that moment, I allowed myself to be still. Not for strategy. Not for purpose. Just to breathe. I closed my eyes and let memories drift in. The first executive meeting, signing my first deal in Tokyo, Daniel's hand slipping from mine, my mother's laughter during our final phone call before she passed. Each memory flickered by like a slow-motion reel, painful and beautiful all at once. I opened my eyes and looked toward the horizon. "I'm no longer someone else's shadow," I whispered. "I am myself. And that's enough. I know my journey isn't one everyone goes through. But maybe, somewhere in your own footsteps, in those tense meetings, in the quiet moments when you feel left behind, in the long nights no one sees, there are pieces of my story that feel familiar. It took me years to understand that true success isn't about how high you stand, but what you've held on to in your heart on the way up. What about you? Have you ever been misjudged, sidelined, or removed from a place that should have been yours? Would you choose to rise? Or to walk away? Have you ever sacrificed so much that you forgot who you were? I'd love to hear your story. Please share it in the comments below. You never know, what you've been through might be the light someone else needs to find their way out of the dark. And if something in this story resonated with you, don't forget to follow the channel. Let's keep walking together through the stories that matter. Not just about work or ambition, but about family, choices, and how each of us can rediscover our true worth in a world that never stops moving.